Hi everybody, in today's video we're talking about non-renewable energy. So this video we're gonna go through the different types of non-renewable energy, the examples of them, the advantages, and also lastly the disadvantages of them. And if you had watched my last video on renewable energy, these green stars mean nuance or some deeper complexities. Basically, as you can see here, this reliable and then there's a green star over here. It's basically evaluation that you can use in your examinations because in A2 geography, you need a lot of evaluation. So let's start off with coal. And the biggest example of coal you can use is China, because not only do they control 13.5% of the world reserves of coal, they also produce 4.8 billion tons of coal annually, and they're the largest producer of coal. An advantage of coal is that it is cheap, because the extraction process is not really technical. You just dig it out from the ground, and when you're transporting it, you usually transport it to the nearest coal power plant instead of shipping it across the world, for example. And therefore, extraction and production and transport costs are relatively low, and therefore coal is quite cheap. Another advantage is that it's reliable because you can produce a lot of electricity with coal. You can control how much you want to put in, and coal can produce 24/7. So unlike renewable energy like solar, for example, which requires sunlight to produce electricity, coal can keep running 24/7 and adjust based on your demand, and therefore it is reliable because it can meet your demand. However, we move on to disadvantages. And one or two disadvantages that are common across coal, oil, and gas is that they are unsustainable and they produce greenhouse gases because they are fossil fuels. Fossil fuels take hundreds of millions of years to regenerate naturally, but we are extracting them at a much higher rate than they are being regenerated. So in the future, we will eventually run out of them, and therefore we can't keep using them forever. And therefore they are unsustainable. Another disadvantage of all three fossil fuels is that they produce greenhouse gas emissions because they are natural stuff. They have a lot of carbon stored in them. And when you're burning them, you're releasing carbon dioxide, you're releasing methane into the atmosphere. And when you do that, that is going to contribute to the greenhouse effect, and that's going to lead to global warming, climate change, which is harmful to everyone. Next up, you have air pollution, because when you're burning coal, coal is the dirtiest fossil fuel, dirtiest energy source out of everything, because when you're burning it, it produces soot, there's particulate matter, and there's also carbon monoxide, and all of which can pollute your air, can cause respiratory problems to your health, and it's just bad overall. If you also didn't know, coal can cause acid rain because coal, and especially lower grade coal, contain quite a lot of sulfur. And if you don't have the technology to remove the sulfur and you're just burning the coal, you're going to release the sulfur into the atmosphere. And when the atmosphere meets up with some sulfur, that's going to produce acid rain, which can damage property, can damage forests, and it can pollute your water sources. And lastly, habitat destruction. The extraction of coal is really, really damaging for the local environment. You have to cut down the trees, you have to remove the topsoil, you have to dig underground, all of which will force animals to migrate because you've destroyed their home, and hence habitat destruction. Moving on to oil. And there's two examples of oil you can use. Number one, which is the biggest example of oil, is OPEC, or the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries. And they control 80% of the world reserves, and you can kind of see an issue with that already. And the second example you can use is the US, because they kind of invented this thing called shale, and you can call it the shale revolution. It's kind of a recent thing, not really, but it's recent in terms of human history, that the US discovered shale. The US in the past had declining oil production because the original way to get oil was running out because it's unsustainable. But when technology came in and they discovered fracking, all of a sudden they produce a lot of oil, and this is called the shale revolution, and therefore the US has shot back up to a major producer of oil. An advantage of oil is that it is reliable, because similar to coal, it can produce a lot of power at once, and it can run 24/7. However, you can see there's a green star over here, which means there's a caveat. Because yes, oil is reliable if you have the supply of oil. It is also quite volatile if you don't have the supply, because OPEC controls 80% of the world's reserves, which means the rest of the world generally has to import the oil. And when OPEC controls 80% of the reserves, they can set the price. And sometimes if they want some political bargaining power, like the Arab-Israeli war in the past, they can increase the price and therefore make it much more expensive. So countries that can't afford the higher price oil will not have the supply, and therefore it's no longer reliable because it's volatile. Prices spike, you don't have the supply, prices drop down, you have the supply. So it's very, very volatile. It's not that reliable. Another issue is some political conflicts in the Middle East, where most of the oil reserves are. Most recent one and the current ongoing one is the Iran war, where Iran closed down the Strait of Hormuz, of which 20% or 20 to 25% of the oil trade goes through. And when the Strait of Hormuz closes, you're not going to have the supply anymore, and therefore it's volatile. Again, if you're relying on oil imports, it's not reliable anymore. So that's the caveat with reliability. The second advantage of oil is that it's portable. Because it's in liquid form, it's much more easier to be transported through supertankers and oil pipelines than a solid coal. Another advantage of oil is its versatility. Whilst these coal, gas, nuclear, you're using it to produce electricity, we're not just talking about electricity, we're talking about energy. So oil can be fractionally distilled to make kerosene, bitumen, petrol, diesel, all of them for airplane fuel or fuel for your cars and trucks. And these are uses of energy, and therefore oil is really, really popular because of all these different uses, and therefore it's an advantage because it has so many uses. Last advantage, it's also cleaner. It's cleaner in the sense that it produces less greenhouse gas emissions than coal, but at the end of the day, it still produces greenhouse gas emissions. Disadvantages, obviously unsustainability and also greenhouse gas emissions, but it also produces air pollution and acid rain. Oil still has a lot of sulfur sometimes, and therefore similar to coal, it can lead to air pollution, it can lead to acid rain. Another issue of oil is that with human error or machine error, you can get oil spills which are really, really harmful to the environment. A big example of that is the BP Deepwater Horizon oil spill that happened in the Gulf of Mexico, Gulf of America, and that just destroyed the marine habitat, destroyed the coastal habitats, and that's bad for the environment. When you have fracking, it also is bad for water pollution, because what happens is you have to break open the bedrock, and sometimes that can cause oil or gas to leak into the waters, the groundwater sources, which can harm communities that rely on the groundwater sources. And as you know, it's very volatile. Moving on to gas. The biggest example you can use is Russia, which has the most reserves in the world. It's number one in the reserves of gas. And again, you can kind of see the issue of that because Russia is quite politically sensitive. But let's start off with the advantages. Number one, it's reliable. Again, similar to coal and oil, it can produce a lot of power at once, and it can run 24/7. Again, the caveat is its volatility. With Russia, there is a lot of political things going on with the Ukraine war, for example. So they may face sanctions, they may hold off oil themselves, and they supply most of the oil to Europe. And when that supply gets cut, it's no longer reliable because you're depending on the imports for its reliability. But when the imports get cut off, you don't really have the genuine reliability. Another issue is that also 20 to 25%, similar to oil, 20 to 25% of the gas import or gas trade goes through the Strait of Hormuz as well. So when Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz, not only does oil trade get hampered with, gas trade also gets hampered with. So when the Strait of Hormuz gets closed, your supply of oil and gas depletes, and therefore it's very volatile and it's not actually reliable. It is cleaner, so it's much more cleaner than oil, it's much more cleaner than coal. It is the cleanest fossil fuel, yet again, it still produces greenhouse gas emissions. The third one is that it's non-contaminating. So with oil, with coal, the extraction process it can have water pollution, it can have habitat destruction, it can have oil spills. But with gas, it's just gas, and it won't really contaminate your environment. So again, it's really, really clean and the least environmentally damaging fossil fuel. But again, we can't just keep using gas because it's unsustainable. It's also cheap, so usually you see coal and gas being the most competitive fossil fuels competing with each other. Oil is much more of a backup because OPEC kind of controls the price. Lastly, it's portable. Similar to oil, you can make it liquid, so liquefy natural gas, or you can keep it in gas form, and it's much more easier to transport in that sense. So these are the advantages of gas. For disadvantages, obviously you know it's unsustainable, you know it produces greenhouse gas emissions, they're fossil fuels, and you know about its volatility in supply, and that's all for gas. Lastly, we move on to nuclear, which is a non-renewable energy source, but it is not a fossil fuel. So just because one thing is non-renewable, one thing is fossil fuel, doesn't mean they're the other thing. So don't get conflated with that. The biggest example of nuclear energy you can use is France, because 70% of their grid is made up of nuclear energy. And in fact, they also export a lot of nuclear energy to its neighboring countries. So France is your best example of nuclear energy. Advantages of nuclear is that it's reliable, it can produce a lot of power, it can produce 24/7, which is the common theme across everything here. Again, yeah, it's reliable. It's also clean. So these things are cleaner, but they still produce greenhouse gas emissions. For nuclear energy, it's completely clean. It doesn't produce any greenhouse gas emissions except water, but that is irrelevant. So it doesn't produce any greenhouse gas emissions, and it can help us fight global warming and climate change. And it also has a small footprint. So this means that one nuclear power plant can produce so much electricity that if you want to produce the how much power is from one nuclear power plant, which is a small footprint, you need like a vast amount of land for solar, for example. You need like a huge solar farm to produce how much electricity you're generating with one nuclear power plant, because it's just that good at generating power. But there's a caveat here, because that caveat is its safety. Nuclear energy has a stigma of being dangerous because of events like the 3 Mile Island incident in Pennsylvania, or Chernobyl, or Fukushima. And these events have kind of made people scared. So countries like Japan and Germany, they have completely phased out nuclear power because of safety concerns. And that's the caveat with small footprint. Yes, one nuclear power plant is very small, it can produce a lot of power. But because of the safety risk involved with nuclear energy, you need a large buffer zone between the nuclear power plant and kind of surrounding cities and civilizations. So the footprint of the power plant is small, but you also have to consider the buffer zone. So that's a small caveat of a small footprint. But there's also a caveat with its safety. The danger risk of nuclear power is kind of over-exaggerated sometimes. Nuclear energy and its risk of a meltdown is really, really low, but people are scared of it, which is kind of curious. So the safety concern of nuclear is more social and more cultural than genuinely factual. So that is another caveat or nuance you can involve in that. Whilst nuclear energy is not a fossil fuel, it is still unsustainable because it uses uranium. And uranium is non-renewable and it will eventually run out. There's also an issue with nuclear waste. Nuclear waste has a long half-life, so that means it takes kind of hundreds of years to decompose. So you have to hold it into casks and barrels and stuff. And what do you do with the waste? The waste is radioactive. You can't really put it next to people. You can't dump it in landfill. Storing it in facilities is kind of dangerous. So what do you do with nuclear waste? That's a question that a lot of people are trying to deal with. We don't know yet. We're trying to hide it underground, or what do we do with nuclear waste? That's a dilemma that a lot of countries have to deal with. It's also really expensive to deal with nuclear waste. So that's one issue of nuclear energy. Another one is that it's really expensive. So the research that goes into nuclear energy, the construction costs, the maintenance costs, And the purchase of uranium is really expensive, to the point that it can cost upwards to $3 billion just to build one nuclear power plant. Everything involved, $3 billion. And if you think about that, can LICs, can poor countries really afford that? The answer is probably not. And lastly, the last disadvantage of nuclear energy is its time and expertise. Whilst nuclear energy is clean, it's reliable, you would think that it can be used to combat climate change fully. But the issue is its time and expertise and also money. To build one nuclear power plant, it's gonna take a long time. You need to get the permits, you need to kind of evacuate some area, you need to build it, and that can cost decades of time, which we don't really have to combat climate change. So that's one issue of that. And other than it being quite expensive, nuclear energy is kind of recently developed as well. So only more developed countries have the expertise, have the knowledge and skilled labor to build nuclear energy. And again, poorer countries which don't have the skilled labor, can they afford the expertise? Can they import it? Can they train their labor force to build nuclear energy? Answer is probably not. So therefore, nuclear energy is not universally applicable. And yes, it is good for the environment, but it's not that feasible everywhere. So that's all for non-renewable energy. I know it's quite a lot, but hopefully now you understand some caveats, and I hope to see you guys in the next video.